Environmentalism, Sustainable Development, and the Company of Young Canadians. A conversation with Kevin Burtt about his new article in Papers in Canadian History and Environment. I'm Sean Courage, and you're listening to episode 70 of Nature's Past, a podcast of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. In the fourth article in Papers in Canadian History and Environment, which listeners can find at niche-canada.org/piche, P-I-C-H-E, Kevin Burtt explores the role of the Company of Young Canadians in early environmental activism around issues that we might refer to today as sustainable development. The Company of Young Canadians was a federally sponsored youth program that operated from 1965 to 1977. As Burtt writes, the company was established by the Pearson Liberal government in 1965 to act as the foot soldiers in Canada's very own war on poverty. The CYC also became involved in emergent environmental activism in the 1960s and 1970s. One CYC activist is even credited with naming Greenpeace. On this episode of the podcast, I speak with Kevin Burtt about this new article and the history of the CYC.
So this is Kevin Burtt, professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. My areas of interest are community development, both at home and abroad, and am almost finished the book on the Company of Young Canadians, from which this article draws upon research from that larger manuscript.
Okay, so Kevin, can you give listeners just a brief outline of your new article?
The article began with a discovery that a Company of Young Canadians volunteer who is featured in the piece, Bill Darnell, was responsible for giving Greenpeace, the huge and now globally renowned environmental action group, its name. And he also accompanied the organization's first active protest against nuclear tests off the coast of Alaska in 1970. So that's kind of where the origins came from. And I started to look through the files on that and see where else the company was working on these kinds of issues. And so it examines the work of the Company of Young Canadians, which is a federally or was a federally sponsored community development program that operated between 1966 and 1976, and its relationship to that emerging environmental movement of the early 1970s. And so I think it sort of draws upon and extends a lot of the work that has been produced lately on grassroots environmental activism, as well as, and I think this is going to be one thing that people will take away from it, is the issue of government support for such ventures in the Canadian context. So largely it examines how the company became, I call it kind of a midwife to initiatives that began to grapple with issues of what could broadly be called sustainable development. So projects that were concerned with directly with environmental effects of air and water pollution, but also to the emerging urban countercultural communes and cooperatives experimenting with things like recycling and organic food production. So that's generally where it goes. And I think, as the piece points out, most of these projects were concerned mostly with economic and social development. The CYC was considered, when it was created by the Pearson government in 1966, the kind of shock troops on the war on poverty. So most of the issues it addressed were economic and social development. But it also then, I think, branched out to see the ways in which issues that linked people, land, and their communities could be thought about in more broadly sustainable ways. And so that's why I use the term sustainable development, even though it did not become broadly popular until pretty much a decade after the company ended its operation, because it did link issues of economic, social justice, and the ecological impacts of human activity together.
Yeah, and I think the articles really timely too. Like in so many of the books in Canadian history on environmentalism, I was seeing references to the Company of Young Canadians in
Mm-hmm.
Ryan O'Connor's book, in
Yeah.
Colin Coates's edited collection on countercultures,
Mm-hmm.
Kathleen Rogers' book on war
Yeah.
resistors. The CYC was kind of coming up in a whole bunch of
Yeah.
different places.
Yeah, and it does. It pops up all over the place. By the time it finished in the by 1976, it had sponsored somewhere in the neighborhood of about 600 individual projects across the country. Now, some of those kind of popped up and lasted for 6 months. Some of them went for years, and it was involved in some of the things that don't make it into the paper. But it was also involved in the rise of the Dene Nation and its opposition to the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. So there are obviously broader environmental issues. Other volunteers who worked for the company in Northern Ontario, even though they never became official CYC projects, some of the people who were involved in that region north of Thunder Bay were also became involved in the protest over Grassy Narrow. So it does have its kind of tentacles into a lot of different areas in that regard.
So what do you think that other researchers might take away from your findings, or what do you hope that they'll take away from this paper?
I think that one of the biggest things is to go back to that mantra, right, of the environmental movement, right, the sort of think global but act local. And I think that, and some more of the recent publications that have come out in the last year or so are starting to look very much at the local level, what was going on at the local level, because much of it did happen at the grassroots, and I think probably even continues to happen at the grassroots in individual communities. And so even though the paper begins with the link to Greenpeace, right, that huge global giant in the environmental movement, I think if we focus solely on those larger ones, we may be missing a lot of what was happening and what it continues to happen, I think, at the local level. And so I think part of that was the strength of what was going on, but it was also in some ways a weakness. And I think the paper notes that where communities or organizations could link together and share strategies, which I think didn't necessarily happen all that much in this early period. But when they did, so I'm thinking of the group I look at in Vancouver that linked issues around air pollution and water pollution, then linked into the potential second crossing of the Burrard Inlet, right? The bridge construction, and so there was opposition groups to that, but based largely even just in urban communities who would then see a freeway going through their backyard. But then they started linking it into how do we think about this in larger terms? So also linking into movements for public transit, which would then have larger implications in terms of economic, social, but also ecological sustainability. So, and that way, some of those projects became much more successful, right, in that regard. The other thing I think that people will take away is that link between the state and emerging environmental movement. So the CYC was obviously government sponsored. It operated at first as a crown corporation with a good arm's length from the government. That arm's length was reduced after 1970, but still largely operated as a kind of free agent in the field. But it was also working with a ton of other programs, which people really haven't tapped into. So opportunities for youth, the local improvement program sponsored by Urban Affairs, but you could also probably look at the Department of Regional Economic Expansion, DRE. You could look at the Department of Health. I think that government archives in this regard will turn up a lot. And then we're not even looking at what's going on at the provincial level either, because the provinces were starting to move into this as well. So really that kind of seed money that came in the early 70s around citizen participation and all of that, I think was really, really crucial in that regard. So would the Canadian environmental movement be as strong as it is without that kind of thing? And so we think today largely about kind of macro policies, carbon taxes, all of those other kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
The government's announcement yesterday, Trudeau government's announcement yesterday of starting up grants for volunteer action among youth.
Mm.
So could this be used for environmental type projects? Can volunteering at the local level to work on issues concerning the environment, environmental sustainability, will this give it a boost? We don't know. But certainly in the era of the 1970s, there was a time at which the kind of desires among young people and others to get involved in this movement were being supported by government, right? And obviously, government can give and it can take away, but it obviously can shape those movements by giving to certain groups and not to others. But I think there might be sort of important policy implications for the current day, I think, in that regard. And then I think the last thing is that larger issue where we think about sustainable development. And I think we think of it mostly now as ecologically sustainable, and certainly in the midst of what we're looking at here in a climate emergency, there might be very good reason to do so. Mm-hmm. And so, but I think it also shows that we need to be cognizant and respect other elements of that kind of triad, right, in terms of economic sustainability and other things as well, because certainly, clearly that's on people's minds, and it certainly was on the minds of most of those of the projects that I look at. Most of them thought about sustaining a lifestyle, certainly in terms of the counterculture. Others thought about sustaining their communities in light of certainly single industry towns. I'm thinking of Sydney and the coal mines, which were disappearing, but also trying to link those strategies together, right? How do you link them? So most people came, I think, or more people were coming to the environmental movement, sort of thinking about in terms of how do they sustain their communities, how do they sustain their livelihoods, all of those other kinds of things. And I think in that regard, it made them grapple with those processes of modernization and globalizations, right, that were making their towns and industries no longer sustainable, but how then they could turn to see that might be true of how that worked also at the ecological level as well. Mm-hmm. So in other words, people didn't necessarily follow a straightforward path to environmental politics in that regard. So I think that might be an important takeaway.
And I mean, you've answered this a little bit in your answer here, but I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on where you think these findings fit in the current scholarship in environmentalism. I think it was Stephen Hawking who wrote years ago that, environmental historians seem to be focused very intently on trying to find the origins of environmentalism, but in Canada, and it seems around the world, that there are more than one origin point. And in the Canadian context, we've got so many books and articles now from different parts of the country that show a kind of concurrent movement that is not actually connected nationally. But here in your case study, you've got a national program that seems to have had some impact on environmentalism as a phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, going back, when it was one of the failings of the company, right? It's called the Company of Young Canadians, but it focused mostly on communities and allowed communities to direct what their volunteers did for them or did with them, right? Volunteers were supposed to basically find and develop local leadership and work with individual groups on the projects that they believed were most pressing for their concerns and their needs and desires. And so that was one of the failings of the company in that regard, is that, people joined the company and they thought of themselves as these kind of, because it was launched in the lead up to the centennial and all the rest of that. And yet it never had a kind of a national strategy and could never explain itself to Canadians in that way. And so like I think I try and get across is, you know, it was kind of one of its greatest strengths, but also one of its greatest weaknesses in that regard, in that there did not seem to be a lot of crosstalk, both within the company, about, you know, how do we turn, you know, how do we draw on the example of what's going on in the forests of New Brunswick and Quebec to what's going on, you know, in Indigenous communities in Northern Alberta, to what's going on in urban, you know, Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. So I think, yeah, we've got these kind of disparate movements that are going on. Not a lot of them are necessarily talking to one another, even within a broadly based or overarching organization known as the Company of Young Canadians, in that regard. So answering those origins questions, I think it's still maybe important in that regard. But it seems certainly in this early period that we have, people are maybe, you know, again, thinking globally and acting locally, but they're certainly not thinking nationally, right? In that sense, and maybe they're tied in to other groups, certainly Greenpeace, the Sierra Club, which are sort of at the heart of what's going on in Vancouver. But not a lot in that kind of national, in that national context, right? In that regard. But again, you know, a lot of this is also bubbling up from the grassroots, and the ways in which some of those sort of large, we shouldn't necessarily see it as a top-down movement, right? In that regard, much of the sustainability of those organizations, right, was driven by what was going on in local chapters, and in local, very, very localized places in that regard.
Right. Well, I think there is a lot in this new article for readers to learn more about the Company of Young Canadians and environmentalism and the emergence of ideas of sustainable development. I'd encourage all listeners to go and take a look at the full paper up at Papers in Canadian History and Environment. Thanks so much, Kevin.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care.
Nature's Past is produced with support from the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This episode was made by Kevin Burchett and me, Sean Courage. Music for Nature's Past was licensed by Creative Commons. For details on the artists, please take a look at our show notes at niche-canada.org/naturespast, where you can also download new episodes, subscribe to the podcast with your favorite podcast player, and leave comments. You can also follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/naturespast. You can always find out more about environmental history research in Canada from the Niche website at niche-canada.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Nature's Past.